All right. Hello. Today is October 14th, 2021. If you are joining from the UK, good evening. If you are here in the States, good morning. Very excited to introduce our speaker today. We have Dr. Jonathan Passmore, who's going to be talking about the coaching mindset. What I believe is probably one of the most essential core competencies of coaching outside of ethical practice. So I'm really delighted to have him here. For those who are here, this session is being recorded. If you are interested in receiving a coaching core competency education unit, we will be delivering one for core competency that will come from the Fielding's Registrar's Office about 4 to 6 weeks after this session. You do need to be in the whole session live to receive that CEU. I will be putting an evaluation link in chat about 10 minutes before we end, and you'll need to also complete that evaluation. So again, I want to welcome you into this space. My name is Dr. Carrie Arnold. I am the Program Director for Evidence Coaching here at Fielding Graduate University. And if you wouldn't mind keeping yourself on mute as you come into the room. So let me talk to you a little bit about Jonathan and what he's going to be delivering for us today. Again, I'm really excited. When I reached out to him, asking him if he would partner with us, he quickly said yes. Jonathan is the director of the Henley Center for Coaching in the UK. And he is a professor of coaching and behavioral change. He's also senior VP of coaching at Coach Hub. He has worked for IBM, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and OPM. He's coached clients all over the world in various different roles, a lot of public entity roles. He is the editor of International Coaching Psychology Review. He is trained as a supervisor and a team coach. He is an EMCC master coach, and he's a fellow with the British Psychology Society. He has published over 30 books. One of them, I am delighted to say, we are using as core curriculum in our coach training program at Fielding Graduate University. It's on becoming a coach, recently published, and it's focused on the recently remodeled 8 core competencies with the ICF. So we're very delighted to have this text available for our students. He's also published over 100 scientific papers and chapters. So we have a true scholar with us today. And Jonathan, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Carrie, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And colleagues, welcome. If it's morning for you, it's really great to connect with you today. If you're connecting in maybe from the East Coast or from the UK or maybe elsewhere in the European Union, it's nice to be speaking to you this evening. So today we're going to be focusing on the coaching mindset, competency 2. And in true coaching style, we're going to have an opportunity for you to engage with 5 questions for your practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the competence, talk about the aspects that make up that particular competence, and then we'll start to think about how we might bring that alive in our individual practice and reflecting on aspects where it may be potential for us to step forward. And I hope at the end of the session, you'll have some very specific, actionable points to take away that will enable you to have a continuous professional development plan, to be enhancing your engagement with reflection, and hopefully broadening your engagement with the wider reading and research literature. And all of that, I guess, fits very nicely with yourselves as scholars in a university program that's mapped to professional practice. So without further conversation, let's just start our journey together with a formal look at the agenda. So we're going to look at competency 2. We're going to consider the importance of continuous learning. We'll talk about the role of reflection as a key skill in that aspect. We're going to look at a systemic framework for reflection. So it's then very practical that you can take a photo of the screen, put in your pocket, use tomorrow, and offer a way to prepare for future coaching sessions. So that's our plan, and we'll take around about 45 minutes or so and then end with some time for some questions at the end. I hope that's okay, Carrie. So let's start. So let's have a look at the definition for a coaching mindset. And as Carrie said, probably when we think about this particular competence, it's a foundational piece. It sits at the very heart of who we are. It's part of our identity. And when we see ourselves in this way, it fundamentally changes the way that we bring alive the other competencies. Almost in the same way of ethical practice is part of who we are, about placing the needs of the client in front of our own needs and bringing that alive through the other competencies in our practice. So when we look at coaching mindset, here's the definition. It develops and maintains a mindset that is open, curious, flexible, and client-centered. So we can hear already starting to think, okay, what does this connect with? What might be informing this? Well, automatically, you're probably thinking Carol Dweck. You're thinking growth mindsets, about the idea of being open, curious, flexible. And we're adding to that very much at the heart of ICF practice is about being client-centered. The work that we do for our clients, it's all about them. It's never about us. So the other thing that probably comes to mind as you start to look at this, and it's a new aspect, but I would suggest that it's central to who we are as coaching practitioners, is this idea that's embedded here about learning, the openness to other experiences, the curiosity, I wonder what that is, being able to flex and change, but being centered on our client. And I guess what brings us together here today, now you might be thinking from an evolutionary psychology perspective, why is it Carrie that's running our program? Why is it me that's sitting here? How is it us as humans? Why aren't there dolphins on coach training programs or the cockroaches? How is it us as a species that's the top of the planetary evolutionary cycle? Well, the answer to that is we are naturally the very best learners, the most flexible and adaptive of species that's enabled us to respond to different parts of the world, to then fit in with the climate and the availability of food, to change, flex and adapt in terms of the development of our society, to learn and apply that learning for onward growth and development. So we've gone from, over the last 5,000 to 8,000 years, hunter-gatherers who were on a hillside picking berries, hunting down an antelope or a buffalo and having that for supper, to progression into settlements and agriculture through an industrial revolution where we have used mechanization to produce our clothing, and now a global economy that has become technologically connected, that enables me to speak to you thousands and thousands of miles away, maybe further west, or maybe potentially you're in the Middle East or you're in Asia connecting into this call. And that technology has revolutionized our world, but we can see how adaptive we have been as a species over the last 18 months. And I don't know about your grandmother, she might have even had a computer 2 years ago, and she's now surfing the web, connecting in on Zoom calls, playing whist with her friends, and has been doing that as a result of the pandemic. She was open to the possibility, well, this new circumstance means that I need to change and adapt. I need to be curious and flexible, learn and apply this. And we as humans are fantastic. So it isn't something that's alien to us. It's already centered within us. And we just have to unleash that evolutionary potential that sits there. So having said that, let's look in a little bit of detail at the 8 aspects of the coaching mindset competence. And you'll be very familiar from your program already with what's contained here. So I'm not going to go through line by line. I'm just going to pick out really some of those headlines that are here in bold. So the first of those I want to talk about is number 2, engages in ongoing learning and development. Now, sometimes students say to me on the Henley programs that I'm engaged with, they'll say, well, Jonathan, it's fantastic. I've now completed the program. I'm a bulletproof coach. I've got my master's degree. I've got my ICF credentialing. That's me done. And I would say that's a really dangerous position, either for those people who are fresh out from programs, or even for old, gnarled coaches like myself who have been engaged in developmental conversations for 2 or 3 decades with individuals. When we stop learning, That's the time that we as coaches need to give up. So learning should be part of an ongoing process that we have, whether we've just completed a program that takes us to ACC, takes us to PCC, or whether you already achieved your MCC and you're out there a seasoned professional with thousands of hours under your practice belt. Ongoing learning and development should be part of who you are, baked into your DNA. Number 3 on the list, ongoing reflective practice. Now, I think we can't become good coaches until we understand who we are, because we need to be in service of our client. We're the tool in that relationship. And only when we understand ourselves, how we can bring ourselves into the coaching conversation, how we can sometimes get ourselves out of the way of the work that our client needs to do, reflective practice sits at the very heart of us exploring who we are. And that's, once again, a continual developmental journey, not something that we can do on a program and put down at the end of our achievement of ACC or PCC. So we need to have this ongoing reflection that takes place maybe at the end of each coaching session, at the end of each week, maybe as we prepare for our supervision sessions. Let me hop to number 5 now. Uses self-awareness and one's intuition to benefit clients. I particularly want to focus on that awareness of the self. But we do need to understand who we are and the multiple roles that we play, the multiple identities that we have. Probably you came to this program from another profession. Maybe you were an accountant or an architect. Maybe you were a trainer, a facilitator. Maybe you're an HR professional. Maybe you're an engineer. And that identity and the training that went into building that identity, maybe over years, maybe even over decades, as you then engage in continuous professional development in that sphere. But you might also have other identities. You might be a father or a mother or a parent. You might be an auntie or an uncle. You might also see yourself in identities such as a runner or an athlete or a sports person or a fisher or a golfer. You might think about other identities you have in relation to your friendship circles or your race or your culture. We have a range of identities that play out, and how we engage in that system, that network in that particular identity may vary depending on that identity and that group of friends, that cultural context in which we find ourselves. I have Jewish friends who become very Jewish when they're engaged with some family members, and then you might see them in a different cultural context, and that won't be such a strong part of their identity that they're bringing out in that other role that they perform. So understanding ourselves in these different identities, thinking about what are the values that are consistent across these, what might be different in those different identities. And all of those make up who we are. Number 7 on the list, mentally and emotionally prepares for a session. Now, I don't know about you, but certainly in the old days before COVID, when we used to actually meet one another and sit around a table and have this sort of wonderful session, it was pretty convenient. You would rush from maybe a meeting out to go and see a client who's arrived at your office to do a coaching conversation. Or maybe you were in a city, wherever that might be, and you're moving between one client's offices and another. And there was often less time to prepare. Maybe you had some time in the foyer. That time seems to have even shrunk smaller when we're in this digital world. We rush off one meeting, we think, I've got to take a quick comfort break, I've got to get a fresh cup of coffee, got to come back in. But are we building in the time to both prepare for the session in terms of reviewing the notes, but also getting ourselves in the right mental and emotional space to be fully present, fully focused on our client, and ensure that the last conversation is not being brought into this. Maybe that was a conversation that we've had, a difficult conversation with our teenager. Maybe that was a difficult, challenging, or emotionally provoking conversation with our previous client. How do we put that into a box, get ourselves prepared for the client who we're about to encounter, so we can be in full service of that individual? And the last one on this list is about seeking help from outside sources. And this view sometimes of new coaches, and I've heard it many times from coaches at Henley and other programs I've been involved in, is a belief that Well, I don't really want to refer on to somebody else because I've completed my training, and that's a sign of weakness if I have to then maybe go to somebody else for help. I've done my mentoring hours. I don't need anybody else. I'm fully self-servicing. And I would suggest actually having support mechanisms in place can really help us, supervision being one part of those, but also having colleagues who we can appropriately refer to. That sometimes we're not the best coach to be in service of that individual. Sometimes the individual might not need coaching, that they might need therapy, or they might need another type of clinical or medical support. So having outside sources where we can seek help, guidance, and potentially refer our clients is an important part of our preparation, the mindset that we have, that it's not a weakness, that it's actually a strength to know our boundaries, our areas of competence, and the areas where that competence comes to an end. And we're best, if we're serving the true client's interest, to refer them to someone else. So my first question for you in this set of 5 is, how do you engage in ongoing learning? So I'm just going to give you just a few seconds to think about that question, and maybe to stretch across if you've got a reflective journal, maybe you've got your course notebook, maybe you've got a little computer sitting in front of you and you like to capture notes on that, or your iPad, whatever's convenient for you. How do you engage in ongoing learning? And here I'm not talking about what you do as part of the program to get into Carrie's Good Books, bringing her an apple on a Monday morning, just so you're in the teacher's good books, or you've done the homework reading. What else do you do on that ongoing professional development? Just give you a moment there to have a think about that, to write down a sentence or 2 or 3. While you do that, I'm going to take a sip and then we'll come back in 10 seconds. Just to reassure you, I know it's gin and tonic hour here in the UK. I've gone for just a simple orange juice this afternoon. Okay, so let's have a little look. Here's some common activities that many professionals would engage in. So of course, you are probably already part of the fielding community of learners, so you're engaged in a formal qualification, or you previously have been. But are you doing other things that are on this list? Maybe tick some of them off that you're already doing. Think about which ones you could start to add. Are you reading coaching books? There are some great ones. Carrie gave a little advert at the top of the hour to the course text that you're reading. Here's the English version. We've got a German version coming out in a couple of months' time. I think there's a Korean and Chinese versions. If you prefer those, they'll be coming out later this year too. Here's another book I produced earlier this year, The Coach's Handbook. And there are some other fabulous books that are out there. Bill Gates used to read a book a week. What are you reading in terms of the number of books that you're consuming that are either coaching related or related to that wider talent and development, or maybe the specific niche in which you work? So are you reading widely? Are you reading coaching journals? Again, as a student on a university-based program, reading coaching journals is probably what you do over your breakfast, bacon and eggs. But having that as part of your wider commitment, how do you continue that once you've finished the program? If you have already finished the program, are you still engaging with reading coaching journals? If you were a scientist, if you were a doctor, you certainly would be reading medical journals, because you'd want to understand what's the latest research around COVID? What's the data telling us about this particular cancer treatment? Should be no different for us as coaching professionals. If we believe this to be an evidence-based discipline, and let me tell you, it should be, then all of us should be engaging actively with academic research and the latest findings that can influence our practice, so we stay at the very top of our game. Next one on the list, in some ways I'm preaching to the choir here, because you've turned up for this session. 40 of you that are in the room with me today. Webinars and conferences, great opportunities for learning. I love listening to colleagues share their insights, their views. I don't always agree, but it gets me thinking, I wonder why they hold that view. What are the assumptions that they're making about the world? What could I take away from this just one thing that might add to my practice. So an encouragement to participate in these sorts of events. Wider training, you might think psychometric training could be useful to you. You might think that there are some specific modalities that you want to strengthen and deepen your knowledge about. Maybe systemic team coaching. Maybe you're thinking about supervision. Maybe you're thinking, oh, I really would like to understand acceptance and commitment coaching and how I might bring that alive in my practice. And of course, the value of mentoring. If you're on an ICF program, an essential ingredient, but also because your US colleagues, there's been less interest so far around the role supervision can play. I will talk a little bit more about that later on. And last two on my list, journaling. So having a journal, just a little book that you keep where almost like a stream of unconscious thoughts, ideas, notes that you capture, thinking about, reflecting on your practice. And journaling is a way of reflective practice. And of course, it builds up over time that allows us to go back, read that and think, what are the patterns that are emerging? How am I changing and developing? So as you look at that list, think about, well, have I got one or two, or have I got 5, 6 or 7 that are listed on those common activities? Question number 2, how long do you spend on ongoing learning each year? Now, maybe it's a little bit of a false question because you have committed yourself to a program and many of you are currently actively engaged in that. But if you're not currently engaged in it, thinking about, well, what would I normally spend? If I've completed the program, what's my expectations of what I think I should be doing? 1 day a year, 1 month a year? What's typical in the industry? So think about that in terms of maybe either a number of days across a year or a number of hours across a year. And once again, I'm going to give you just a few seconds to have a think about that. Write something down, and then I'll share with you some research data. Now, I always took good practice to be, when I was responsible very early in my career for training and development in an organization, I always used to think, well, back in the 1980s, and I had a team of trainers who were working for me, 7 days was my sort of target, an average of 7 days a year. If I get people on 7 days training across a year, I thought that was okay. So let's have a look at what's said in relation to coaching. This is drawn from a 2017 research study where we surveyed coaches and asked them what they were actually doing. So you can see a number of hours listed here on our pie chart. There are some who are doing less than 5. Really, I think we should take them out to the car park and give them a good telling off. Less than 5 hours. I mean, really, you're talking about around about half a day of learning across probably somewhere in the region, 220 to 250 working days in the year, depending on how much holiday that you have and how keen you are to work. So to go for less than half a day across that period of time, pretty poor. Next step up, 6 to 15 hours. So you're talking about 1 or 2 days really here. 23% of people said that they did 1 or 2 days. I still think that's way below what we should be expecting if we are open and curious learners. Back to that definition. 16 to 30 hours, so you're talking 3 or 4 days across a year. 37%, largest proportion. I think that's probably not enough if we see ourselves being a professional coach who's actively engaging and earning a significant portion of our income from coaching-based activities. Now, of course, you're doing coaching as part of a leadership or you're doing coaching as part of training, then you might think, well, I might need to do 100 days of coaching or 50 days of coaching activity in a year. So as a result, I could scale appropriately my coach training back because I'm also doing training in other areas, for example, as a facilitator or a mediator or a trainer or a specialist in another area. Now, the 2 areas where I think we should be paying some attention to, 41 hours, well, that's probably just a little bit over 5 days to 60 hours, and then 15% of them said that they were doing more than 60 hours. I think if you aim for doing 60 hours plus, if you are a full-time coach, that's the sweet spot. That means you've probably done 2 fairly substantial courses. But remember, this also includes reading books, reading research articles, could include your reflective journaling. So already, well, actually, it could be very easy to then have one course that might make up the first part of that. Then if I add in my supervision and mentoring, and I add in my reflective journaling, and I add in that I'm reading, let's say, a book a week or even a book a month, where you might do an hour a day of reading or half an hour of reading if you're on a bus or a train, then you could quite quickly move up to achieving that 60 hours. So think about how your number of hours that you are doing or you were thinking that you would be doing compares with this, and then ask yourself, would I want to be doing more? Maybe you put down 90 hours. Do I want to be doing less? Okay, next is a process. So let me share with you a process for learning. And as you look at this, it won't be surprising. Hold on a minute here. This feels very familiar to what we might be doing in helping people in that learning journey that they go on in a coaching conversation. So define, where are you now? Where am I aiming? So define, what's my goal? What's my aim? And then establish assessment. What level am I operating at now? So we do some sort of evaluation of our level. Sometimes that can be a technical evaluation. We could assess ourselves against competencies. Sometimes it may be a more sort of finger in the air. Which way is the wind blowing? How strong is it blowing? So that might be less accurate and just more of a feel, a heuristic. Number 3, what interventions might help me? Do I particularly enjoy reading articles and books? What I prefer and my learning style is that I would prefer to engage through going on a course, talking to other people, listening to a trainer. Different people do like to learn in different ways. There has been in the past quite a lot of focus on learning styles, but the research evidence said that actually when we looked at learning styles, most people can learn in a variety of different ways, and it depends on the knowledge that they're engaging with as to how they prefer to learn. So just as a quick example of that, when we were talking about reviewing the ICF competencies, I gave this as a piece of evidence, and the reason why I thought learning styles was not something that should be in the competency framework. The research evidence was very weak around it. So I love learning from books. You probably could guess that from the number of books that I've written. I really enjoy reading and I enjoy writing. But when it comes to IKEA furniture, I don't know if any of you have been to IKEA. You get the box and it's in 53 pieces, and then you open it up, and of course there's a little instruction kit with it, and you then have to read the instruction kit to put it together. Now, unfortunately, even though I have a preference for reading and a logical approach to it, when the IKEA box comes, my natural style is to open the box and start putting the pieces together. And then unfortunately what happens is usually I've attached part B to part F and part F to part W, and my wife comes in and says, "Hey, you should do it like that." She's read the instructions, she has to take it apart and do the thing properly. So sometimes we have in some contexts a learning style that might lead us in one direction, but in other contexts we might prefer a different way of engaging. So having thought about our interventions, we then move on to how will we engage with our new material. We start to think about, how do I personalize that? What does that mean to me? As I read the book, I'll start thinking about, well, what does that mean for my individual practice? How could I begin to bring that alive? And then as I plan to do that, I can start to evaluate it in terms of the impact that it has on my work, the impact that it has on clients. And this continuous professional development cycle is one that's worth holding in our head as we start to plan our own interventions, as you start to think about your own continuous professional development plan for the coming year. Where are you aiming? What level are you at now? What interventions? How will you engage with that? How do you then translate that into your own practice? How do you make sense of it, in other words? And then how do you evaluate its impact on your work? So question number 3, let's give you a few moments to think about that. How do you currently reflect on your practice? Now, maybe you just get on and go and do things and you spend no time reflecting at all. You simply dive forward. Now, maybe you come out from a coaching session and you spend a few minutes thinking, if you're in the car, stuck in traffic, or if you're on a journey home, on the bus or the train, just thinking about how that was. Or maybe you allow time, if you've been on a Zoom call or a team meet, and you're thinking, okay, what went well? What did my client give me feedback on? What would have been even better if? And I asked my question that question to my client, and they gave me some specific feedback. And then you might document that. Maybe you just turn that over in your mind. Alternatively, you might sit down there and capture over 5 or 10 or 30 minutes, just a piece of reflective writing. But what do you do? How do you currently reflect now? I'll give you a few seconds just to make a note. Think about that question for yourself. So let's talk a little bit about reflective practice. And I guess the reality is, and you might have said, oh yeah, I'm very good at doing that, and you will probably be the exception. Reality is most people don't actively reflect on each session. And I'd be encouraging you to be different from the average coach, and probably as fielding coaches, you're already different from average coaches. You're the wonderful Carrie, you've got a great team of tutors, you're at a university program, you're doing an accredited ACTP program. All of that structure and engagement with the literature would lead you towards being disciplined and seeking to achieve the high standards in your practice. So add to that, if you don't already, and create a discipline where reflective practice, journaling, and a structured process are part of what you do each and every coaching conversation, as you try and bring those aspects alive, and you start to think about, what does this mean for my practice? How can I continue to get better? And here I'm not looking at transformational change. And I know a lot of coaches often talk about this in terms of the work that they do with clients. And certainly way back in the 2005s and 2007s, there were people, I'd go to conferences, I'd listen to events not different from this, and I'd sit there in the back row, and they would suggest that coaching was fairy dust. That if they were transformational in their conversation, they sprinkled the fairy dust across the person, and wow, that was incredible. I have changed them to be somebody else. And maybe I'm just a rubbish coach. But the reality is, in most conversations, individuals make incremental change, step by step, a behavior change for most of us, including my clients and me, that often it's tricky, it's difficult. So having a structured process can help people to move forward, and being kind and forgiving to ourselves, as well as helping our clients to be kind and forgiving to themselves. But when they make the relapse or the slip and they go back to the old behaviors, that's okay. You can just pick yourselves up, dust yourselves off, and keep going forward. And we need to have the same attitude for ourselves, that if we don't reflect after one coaching session, it's not all lost. There's always the next opportunity. So here's a framework to help you in your self-reflective journey. And we've brought this alive in a number of our books. Let me explain the Henley 8 as a framework for helping you write your reflective journal. So we thought, well, it can be really difficult, and sometimes people get drawn into being very descriptive in their reflective journals. In other words, they don't reflect, they describe. And they talk about what they did, what the client did. And I've certainly read some reflective journals. I had one, I must say, it was pre-pandemic, where one of my students wrote their reflective journal, and it was lovely because they met their client in a hotel, and they described how the reception area was, which was very nice. And then they described how they decided they were going to go through to have some tea, English, so they were going to have afternoon tea. And then they described the cakes that they had. They described the cakes that their client had. It was a little bit like a sort of a culinary delight. My mouth was watering at the thought of all this, but there was no reflection. There was no engagement about, well, how did they engage in the coaching session? How were they managing themselves, their emotion, their behavior? What were they being cognizant of in that relationship? What was getting in their way? None of that reflective process, just a pure description, not even of the coaching, but of their meeting, their encounter with the client. So what we encourage you to do is to think about this framework and writing a paragraph in response to each of these questions. By all means, take a photograph of this if that's helpful for you. And then you use that. And what you'll find is almost a little bit like a coaching model. It will gradually become natural as you start to do this for the 5th time, the 10th time, the 55th time. So the first thing we say is, what did I notice? Now, this is a descriptive paragraph. And by paragraph, I'm really meaning 4, 5, 6 sentences. What did you notice? And here we want individuals to particularly pick out a critical moment. And it was one of those aha moments where maybe you took a breath, or it particularly engaged you as a significant turning point in the conversation. So what did you notice? And you might describe what you noticed, maybe what the client did or what was happening in that interaction between you and them. Then there's the opportunity, having had that brief description of what was happening, to go into how you responded. Now, most of us would often think about our response in terms of a behavior. I scratched my head. But beneath that scratching of a head, that physical movement, that behavior that I did, there are some deeper aspects that are a part of our response. I scratched my head, but alongside that, I thought. So I wondered what was going on. So I had a thought. I was curious. I was confused, maybe, was the thinking. And also might have had an emotional response to that. That emotional response might have been anxiety. Because I was curious, that provoked anxiety in me. And I might have had a physiological sensation alongside that. So my heart rate might have increased. I might have observed in myself moistening of my hands. I might have felt my temperature rising, almost of a blush, a flush coming up over my skin, connected to that anxiety, connected to the thought that I wasn't really sure. That was all connected and displayed through the behavior of scratching my head. So we want an exploration of that interconnection between what it is to be a psychologically informed human, our cognitions, our emotions, and our behaviors. And those physiological sensations often give us a clue to the emotion that we might be experiencing. Question number 3. What might it tell me about me as an individual? So here we're inviting you to start thinking about what are the beliefs, the values that you might hold in your identity as an individual. And we then repeat the question, which is quite curious. What might it tell me about me as a coach? So we recognize that transition towards coach is not always fully integrated with who we might primarily see ourselves as. So there may be a separating out, and though I might have a series of values or beliefs that guide me in this context, they may be the same, or they might be different from the values and beliefs and assumptions I'm making about the world as a coach. And here we want to really get under the surface to really start to explore the unconscious biases that we might hold that help us navigate in a shorthand way the world. So a paragraph or 2 of writing as we explore those values, beliefs, assumptions, biases, prejudices that all of us as human beings have. And then think about them not just as an individual in our primary identity, but thinking about them in this new identity that we're beginning to take on as a coach. And then in that coaching identity, thinking about 2 further questions. What strengths do those values, beliefs, biases, prejudices offer to me? And then also, what pitfalls might I need to be aware of? So often our biases can help us to shortcut our thinking process. We're linking here really, I suppose, to Daniel Kahneman's work in Fast and Slow Thinking. Sometimes we do fast stuff but that's often full of errors and mistakes, but it can get us out of a situation. Much better that we run away from the scramble in the bushes, that there's something going on. Because if it was a saber-toothed tiger and we stopped to wait and find out, our ancestors never existed. So we have a bias towards the negative assumption that actually it is the saber-toothed tiger and not just a large pheasant. Strengths and pitfalls. Again, some reflection around each of those. And then the final two questions for this self-reflective process of the Henley 8 is, what's my learning from this insight that I've gained about myself? And what would I choose, or could I choose, to do differently next time? So we're beginning to take the insight into planning some action as an alternative approach. Not that we will do that, but what we're trying to help ourselves to be is more self-aware and to become more choiceful. Well, that's exactly what the coaching process is aimed at helping our clients to be: more insightful, more choiceful in how they respond to situations. So a series of questions that can guide you in your self-reflective process, very simple to follow. And we bring that alive, as I say, in the books that I've just shown you earlier, the Coach's Handbook, and also in Becoming a Coach. We talk a little bit about that model there. So question 4, how do you prepare for each coaching session? So let me just give you a moment to just turn over in your mind, maybe capture 1 or 2 words down on a piece of paper. I'll take another sip of my orange, and then I'll come back and give you some thoughts around this. So preparing for each session. No doubt that you have already got, and colleagues like Carrie and the other tutors on Fielding Program encourage you to think about contracting. Contracting with the organization, contracting with the individual client, contracting for each session as you prepare to move forward. You might also do some preparation in terms of organizational knowledge. And there is much debate about whether it helps to have an understanding of the cultural or systemic or industry context. And my view consistently is it is helpful, not because we want to bring that knowledge to bear to say, well, I know what you should do in this situation, but just so we understand the language used by our client, that if they're working in financial services and they're talking about particular financial instruments, if we're able to then use that language in a question, that can be very powerful for the client to continue that conversation. And next of all is about notes from our last session in preparation, just reviewing those, making sure that we understand from a preparation point of view, everything is order. And I as you've probably read, I'm not an advocate of making extensive notes. That's a combination of, one, being naturally lazy, and secondly is a desire really to minimize my focus on capturing information down on a piece of paper, and to maximize my focus on the individual client who's sitting in front of me. And the more I'm still and present, fully present with them, I don't have the time or the energy to then capture large amounts of what they're saying. So I tend to just capture my notes around a series of headings, which I call PIPs. And essentially these are just the key ingredients. Maybe they might mention the name of their boss, I might write that down, or the name of their partner, I might write that down. Personal pieces of information. I might write some ideas. Oh, that would be interesting. Maybe we could go and explore that at the next coaching session. Maybe sort of hypothesis of things that might be helpful for the client to go and capture. And then also plans of action. Those can be really useful things if the client is saying, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Next time we meet, how did you get on with X? How did you get on with Y? How did you get on with Z? And last of all, S, suggestions. Suggestions are really things that the client said, oh, can you recommend a really good book on this? Well, I'll just make a little note of that. I'll go away. If something didn't come to mind immediately, I can send them a TED talk. I might give them a suggestion of a book. I might send them a book to go and have a read of, or an article, or some additional reading. So that's the physical preparation that we can make, but that's not enough. we need to ensure that we're also in the right emotional state. One thing that can help is to be aware of that emotional state and carry out a little body scan. So I used to do this when I was physically meeting clients, and I try and make sure that I have the time to just go and do this. And it can be as short as 2 or 3 minutes, just a gentle breathing exercise where we've got enough time, almost the amount of time that it would take to go and have a bathroom break. And you're just breathing, just being mindful about any tension that's in your body, being aware of the different parts of your body from the top of your head to the tips of your toes, running down through the physicality of your body, being aware of any tensions, breathing into those, just letting go of what happened 5 minutes ago, 3 hours ago, and to be fully present, fully focused on your client as they step in to that digital meeting or physical meeting room with you for the next session. So the final question I wanted to talk a little bit about is, what would you do to prepare your plan to achieve the coaching mindset? And then in a moment or two, I'm going to talk a little bit about closing, and then we'll move in to some questions for the final segment of our time together, the last 10 minutes or so. So just have a think as you have engaged with the content today. What will you do to develop your plan to achieve a coaching mindset? We've talked about a number of things. What do you want to commit to yourself? So if you've got a reflective journal or you've been making some notes today, just make a little note down, and then we'll start back again in 10 seconds. So I would suggest that having a personal development plan is a great way of demonstrating your ongoing professional personal development. And it should combine formal, so maybe webinars, training courses, with informal reading of books and articles, and your reflective journaling. But having that set out as a plan, take the opportunity as you reach the top of the hour today, just to think, okay, what are the 3 or 4 things that I'm going to put onto my personal development plan as a series of actions I'm going to commit myself to? And then maybe this evening over dinner, as you talk about what you've done today, how you've engaged with this webinar this morning, at lunchtime, or this evening, depending on where you are in the world, maybe sharing with your partner or with a friend on a phone call or another family member what you're committing yourself to do, and invite them to be a supporter of you and to regularly just check in with you how you're progressing with that plan. Because we all slip, we all forget, we all don't always deliver on all the things that we would like to. And just having somebody who's on your side, who's encouraging you, checking in, just saying, how are you getting on with that? You said you're going to read a book a month or a book a week or a book a day if you're very ambitious. How's that going? What are you reading at the moment? Those sorts of questions just are a gentle way of encouraging and supporting us on our onward development journey. And all we're doing, all we're aspiring towards, is just making 1% improvements. And if, like the elite athletes of the world, we continue to make continuous 1% improvements gradually over time, you too will become an elite performer. So there's a few things that you might want to follow up. You can connect to me on LinkedIn. So it'd be lovely to hear from you about today's session. You can get some free research at Henley Centre for Coaching. You can join our centre. You can access also on my personal website, jonathanpassmore.com, a whole set of probably 100+ articles, book chapters and other resources, all available for free for you to download and use as part of your research. And as I mentioned at the top of the hour, I'm also, apart from being involved with Henley, involved with Coach Hub. And I was just talking to Carrie about that. And we've got a host of adverts out, and we're looking for fabulous people in the United States to come and work for us. So if that's of interest, you can connect to me on LinkedIn and I'll tell you more about it. So I'll hand back to Carrie to field our questions. Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah, there's a couple questions real quick. You mentioned the acronym PIPS, P-I-P-S. Can you remind us what the S stands for?
Suggestions.
Thank you. There
So
was
these are things that we might say to the client, oh, you should have a read of. So at the moment, just as a little example, I just disappear off the screen for a moment. My current book I'm reading is this. I love it. It's really good. So Smart Work, that isn't very good. There it is. Smart Work by Joe Owen. That's really good. And given that most of us are thinking about hybrid working, we're working with people who are trying to cope with hybrid and remote working. It's been a fabulous book. And the thing I read over the summer that's still on my desk, because I like it so much, is The Good Ancestor. And so I often recommend staff to go, have a read of this. You might like it too. And people hopefully make recommendations to me. And that's how we can continue our devouring of knowledge and continuing to grow and develop.
Thank you. Can you say a little bit about, a lot of times coaches learn by doing. And so how would you sort of reference the learning by doing part?
Well, we only learn by doing when we reflect. So it's the reflection part. If we just simply engage in a process mindlessly, there is no learning. So all species will reflect. So you look at pigeons, that's the behavioral psychology research, Skinner's work, for example. Pigeons and rats learn pretty quickly, but they're stimulated by a reward. We can play a very different game that we don't necessarily, in marshmallow test, for example, need that immediate reward. We can sometimes defer our gratification in a way that other more simpler mammals don't. So if you've seen the marshmallow test, I'm sorry to say I did it on both of my children when they were 4. You ask a 4-year-old, would you like them? You put the marshmallow in front of them and you say, you can have that marshmallow now if you like. But I am going to go away. And if I want to come back in a few minutes' time, it's still there. You can have 2 marshmallows. And so children then have a choice. And around about half children seem to wish to eat the marshmallow first of all, but others have developed strategies to help them defer their gratification. They'd really like 2 marshmallows. And some of the strategies, the most effective strategy is not to look at the marshmallows, to look out the window. Suddenly I'm not seeing the marshmallow, it's not really there, I'm thinking about it, I'm looking at what's going on out the window. So as humans, we're constantly thinking, okay, how can I engage in this process? The reflection is often what many people are used to doing. We just need to amplify that through our practice and then make it a more conscious and concrete experience for the suggestion of the Henley 8. So here's a process, and by capturing that in a journal means that we've then also got the meta learning that can happen by looking back of patterns over time, and I get immense value. And I usually do it in holiday periods, to tell you the truth, at an Easter where things are a little bit quiet, or at the Christmas holidays or the summer holidays, and things are just winding down. And I just take an hour with a coffee and just flick back through my reflective journal. What am I noticing as I read some of the inserts? Some things make me laugh, think about particular clients, but I'm just looking for patterns. What's been going on for me for the last 2 or 3 months, and just observe the pattern that's emerged there.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. You mentioned briefly, the context of our client, having some knowledge of their context. And you also mentioned the pandemic and what we've all experienced. Dr. Wildflower just added a question. What do we as coaches, given everything we've been through around social unrest, racial unrest, what's happening in the world with climate, how do you suggest we incorporate mindfulness around some of those bigger world issues?
Well, first of all, hello, Lenny. It's lovely that you're on the call. It's really nice to connect with you. I think those are seminal issues for us. First of all, the issue around the environment. If there are things that the ICF and professional bodies should be engaging with, at the top of their list should be environmental considerations and equity and justice. And I know that there is a refocusing of research priorities and considerations, and we need to figure out as coaches. I did a session last night for Columbia's conference, actually, and I spoke about this exact issue. Number 1 on our list, how do we figure out as coaches what's our role in the existential crisis for humanity? And when our grandchildren ask us, dad or grandma, what were you doing when the planet was burning? If our only answer was, I was throwing more coals on the fire, in other words, I was helping my clients to only expand their profits at the expense of the environment, they will hold us in the same contempt that we hold the people who shipped humanity from West Africa to the colonies. We seriously need to be dealing with this issue. We need to think about ourselves, but we need to bring it into our coaching conversations. And that's difficult. I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think we need to find ways of doing that. And the second challenge that Lenny rightly brings up to our attention is the issue around social justice and equity. And some of you might be interested in a research report that myself and a colleague, Charmaine Roche, have been engaged with over the last 18 months. We're about to publish on this. It's the first significant race in coaching research study. And we are advocating that the coaching industry, coaches, training bodies, service organizations, professional bodies commit to 15 recommendations to begin to address the racial injustice, the systemic structural racism that exists within coaching. And the evidence that we have for that, we gathered views from across the coaching system. And then in a separate study, we also looked at evidence regarding representation. So Black coaches in particular, specifically are statistically underrepresented in the coaching industry. Why is that the case? And secondly, we looked at rates of pay, and Black coaches are paid less than white coaches. And you also, given the faces that I can see in front of me, in a previous study, 2017, we found that female coaches are paid less than male coaches. So those structural inequalities that we see in wider society are replicated in coaching. And if we're a progressive industry, if we are concerned with social justice around gender and race, we also need to be considering those. Thank you, Lenny, for bringing that question up. You've probably got
Jonathan,
a view. Hello.
I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. How are you?
Hi. Jonathan and I are about ready to have our martinis. But the thing that I find is coaching, I mean, really good coaching, as you've been talking about brilliantly in Core Competency 5. And is that 5 or I can't remember.
Two.
That coaching mindset. We're walking a line between really meeting the need of a client, working with a client, helping a client to grow. And there's all these other issues in the world. And the question is, do we leave them to the teachers, or do we insert them, or how do we incorporate the fact that, particularly in America, the issues of racism and intolerance and sexism, all of this stuff is, I mean, it's you know, America's on fire in terms of this, and the whole issue of the climate. So I'm continually trying to figure out how this could happen inside of a coaching engagement or inside of training for coaching or whatever. So I leave it to Carrie. She's going to figure it out for us.
I think it's a great question, Lenny, and I don't think there are easy answers, and easy answers are ones that everybody agrees with. So I hold the view that we should be bringing it into training. I hold the view that we as coaches should be bringing it into coaching conversations, and we do that by helping our clients to connect to their system. So we take a systemic view, and we see systems as being part of individuals being situated in a moment in time. And one thing that often gets people to sit up is the question about, will your grandchildren think about what you were doing? Are you proud about this? We might not express it as directly as I'm expressing it there, but asking that question about future generations and how they will consider the actions of that individual and that organization often starts people to think about the longer term of the legacy that they leave. And no doubt many colleagues have come across seventh generation thinking and how we get people to think not just for this generation and how we fill our pockets and our personal individual greed, but we think about what's the effect on our children, our children's children, or 7 generations into the future. That Indigenous people often had that care and consideration for how they treated the environment because they took the long view.
Jonathan, thank you for your time today. We are at the top of the hour, and this has been a rich session, and you've taken us deeper into understanding this mindset and what it means to coach in the context we're in today. So on behalf of Fielding, thank you very much. For those who are still on the line, thank you. Please be sure to check out the chat for the link to complete the evaluation, and we will have this recording available on the website. For those who need to go, have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much indeed for connecting in. Really lovely to connect to you.